Silas leaned toward the bioluminescent Orion fern, whispering a sequence of low, rhythmic vibrations that sounded like wet stones grinding together. No human vocal cord should have been capable of that specific frequency. Slowly, the delicate blue leaves of the plant bruised into a deep, sickly violet. Would you have opened the obsidian shard, knowing that the truth might turn your husband into a stranger? I chose to look. I'm still not sure if I was right. Behind the reinforced glass of the observation deck, my multi-jointed neck tilted at a sharp, analytical angle. This was Silas, my husband, a Tier 3 biological entity belonging to a species the Ethelgard hegemony considered a decorative curiosity. On paper, the Terrans were a fragile people, lacking the bioelectric fields of the ominous or the structural density of my own kin. Silas was particularly unremarkable, a man who preferred the damp warmth of the atmospheric dome to the cold prestige of the high courts. Yet, as I watched him, his right thumb tapped a steady, silent tempo against his thigh. He seemed to be counting something in the stillness. Earlier that morning, Silas had accidentally sheared the heavy decorative handle off the guest wing door while trying to welcome a junior diplomat. "Oh, goodness," he had muttered, cradling the shattered brass as if it were a wounded bird. "I am so sorry, little thing." He spent 10 minutes apologizing to the inanimate metal. I touched my throat, the traditional Ethelgard gesture for a truth too heavy to speak, and dismissed the incident as the clumsiness of an unevolved Tier 3. Our archival data was clear. Humans were evolutionary accidents, physically inferior in every measurable metric. They were strategic liabilities, useful only for their strange, stubborn capacity for empathy. "The Orion fern needs specific pressurized care, Valen," he'd said later, his voice soft as he adjusted the dome's atmosphere controls. "It thrives on the stress of the weight." I took his word for it, just as I took his word for his frequent 2 a.m. retreats into the garden. I classified his 72-hour silence as a quirky Terran meditation, a biological necessity for a mind too simple to process the complexities of hegemony rule. He was my respite from the cold machinery of statecraft, a harmless gardener in a galaxy of predators. 6 cycles later, the envoy from the ominous sector arrived. The ominous were the galaxy's apex predators, a species of living shadows that had never once seeded a single system without a century of slaughter. They did not negotiate, they consumed. As the Spire's docking bay hissed open, the air turned cold with their presence. My court held its breath. Panic should have seized my court, but instead, I felt a strange, cold shift in the room. The lead envoy, a towering creature of jagged obsidian plates, stopped dead in the center of the hall. He didn't look at me, the High Overseer. He looked past me, toward the garden entrance where Silas stood, still wearing his dirt-stained gardening gloves. Without a word of preamble, the envoy dropped to his primary joints in a gesture of absolute, terrifying submission. We did not know he was here. The creature vibrated, its voice a ragged scraping sound. "We offer the trade routes. All of them. Please, tell the relentless one we seek no quarrel." "Is there a problem with the air?" I asked, my voice echoing in the hall. "The air is fine," the envoy hissed, its obsidian plates rattling. "It is the man who breathes it that concerns us." My court fell into a silence so thick it felt like physical pressure. Silas didn't move. He simply stood there, his thumb continuing that rhythmic tap-tap-tap against his leg. Into the void of my understanding, 1,000 questions rushed at once. Why would the most violent civilization in the quadrant yield to a man who apologized to door handles? That evening, we hosted the diplomatic dinner. Silas sat beside me, dressed in formal Ethelgard silks that looked uncomfortable on his broad shoulders. As he bit into a piece of sharp, high citrus fruit, I saw it, the suppression face. His jaw tightened until the muscles corded like steel cables, and his eyes, usually warm and soft, flattened into 2 discs of lightless gray. It was the same look he had given the envoy, a mask of such intense internal effort that it made the air around him feel heavy. The heavy court silence felt like a physical weight. Doubt is a slow poison for a ruler. Driven by a clinical need for clarity, I accessed the residential security logs. Every night at 2 a.m., Silas didn't meditate. He sat in the center of the dome, unmoving, staring at the door as if he were waiting for a war that hadn't arrived yet. The bioscans showed his heart rate was perfectly synchronized with the atmospheric pumps. Silas was not resting. He was holding a perimeter. Beneath the palace foundations lay the restricted databanks, where the Obsidian Shard archive was kept, a collection of records from a dead civilization. My fingers trembled as I bypassed the Tier 3 security locks. I searched for Silas Kale and found nothing. I searched for Relentless. The screen flickered, then flooded with a single, red-bordered file. It wasn't a military record. It was a containment protocol. The file contained no tally of deaths. No bodies had been left behind by Silas's unit in any recorded theater of war. Instead, the Obsidian Shard detailed psychological attrition. The Relentless were Terran anomalies, men and women whose presence alone triggered a primal, biological dread in non-human species. It was a failure of the prey response, a sensory overload that suggested the human was a predator too large for the galaxy to perceive. I read of the 72-hour silence of Kalen, a human colony where a child of 6 was found clutching a wooden starship in the center of a city. Every adult inhabitant of that world had simply walked into the sea rather than remain in the same hemisphere as the Relentless unit. Silas wasn't a gardener. He was a siege weapon in repose. Outside the spire, the Seventh System Coalition had arrived. Their warships blotted out the stars of the ominous sector, a wall of cold iron demanding the hegemony's total surrender. My general screamed for tactical strikes. Silas, however, stood in the center of the dome, meticulously checking the pH balance of a soil sample using a small glass dropper. One drop fell, then another. He looked up, and I saw the mask slipping. "They have forgotten," he said, his voice a low vibration that made the glass of the dome hum. "Valen, I need to remind them of the reality of their situation. You are one man against a fleet, Silas," I replied, my multi-jointed neck twitching in a rhythm of pure panic. "They will vaporize the spire before you reach their bridge." "No," he whispered, stepping closer until I could smell the ozone and damp earth on his skin. "They will watch me walk through the door, and then they will remember why they signed the treaties in the first place." He simply touched my throat, the Ethelgard gesture for a final truth, and walked toward the civilian shuttle bay. He carried no weapons. In his hand, he held only a small pouch of dried Orion leaves. For 72 hours, the galaxy held its breath. No shots were fired. No signals were broadcast from the Coalition flagship. Silas had simply entered the vessel and sat in the center of their command bridge. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just existed. Within the flagship's sensor logs, the data would later show the absolute collapse of the Coalition High Command. Their heart rates spiked. Their bioelectric fields frayed into static under the weight of his stillness. Silas placed a single, dried Orion leaf on the envoy's throat without blinking. The Coalition withdrew. Their fleets scattered like dust in a solar wind, issuing a total, groveling apology before Silas had even cleared the atmosphere. 5 cycles later, peace has become a heavy thing. Silas returned to his dome, his domestic chores resumed with a terrifying, rhythmic precision. When an ambassador from the Krell Empire recently insulted our decorative Terran during a state dinner, Silas didn't shout. He didn't reach for a blade. Across the table, Silas looked at the Krell diplomat. The suppression face returned, that corded steel in his jaw, that lightless gray in his eyes. Silas simply clipped a stray thread from his silk sleeve with his pruning shears. On the white cloth sat the shears, steel and shadow against the light. Silas stood, his thumb beginning that steady tap-tap-tap against his thigh. He was counting. The Orion fern in the corner turned a bruised, deep violet.